In this video, I'm going to give you an introduction to the essential key ingredients of rendering or shading any hard surfaces. It doesn't really matter what you're rendering, all surfaces obey the law of physics. Even if you're not intending to render things realistically, or you intend to work abstractly, knowledge of these things will be important if you want to create good art. So let's jump in. The first thing to note is that most shading boils down to the simple observation of values. All values appear relative to other values. In other words, light colors are light because of the dark values around them, and vice versa. The most significant aspect of values, besides how they relate to the other values, is the transitions between the values. I can't state this more strongly. This is the key to rendering. It's so important that I'd like to start with this exercise, which seems simple, but could take years to really master. In this example, you'll see a strip of tone or value transitions. The task is to copy the transitions as exactly as you can. Repeat the exercise over and over until you feel you can master this, and it will make the rest of your renderings go a lot smoother. Download the PSD file and you'll get this file with several numbered challenges. Working from top to bottom, you'll see that each one is a little harder than the one above it. Work on the layer that's highlighted in green so you don't have to deal with masking. Use only a soft airbrush of just black and white. And slowly build up the tones, and do the best you can to match the value changes. Pay close attention to the transitions. Are they soft or are they crisp? Okay, let's raise the bar a little. When light falls on an object, it reacts in predictable ways. This is good as it allows us artists to create patterns of light and dark that viewers will be tricked into thinking it looks like light falling on a surface. The key thing to this is that each surface has an orientation. If you imagine an arrow pointing directly up from a surface, like this is called a surface normal in 3D modeling or in mathematics, but you can think of it as the direction the surface is pointing. The angle that this orientation makes with a light source will determine how much the light is illuminating the surface. So if it's pointing right at the light, it's bright, and if it's pointing away, it's dark. Consider this faceted band. These faces are pointing towards the light and are bright. These point away and are dark. In between, they gradually change from light to dark. If we increase the number of facets, it becomes smooth, and becomes like a tube or a cylinder. Or it can be like a sphere. But here's the key concept. You ready? Because of this, a change in value means a change in surface orientation. Artists are always talking about surface breaks, and this is what they mean. Moving across a surface, as the surface changes direction, it creates a surface break, which will in most cases have a different value. And the opposite is true, which is very important for the artist, that to show a surface has changed orientation, you can give it a different value. Simple, right? Okay, let's add some complexity. Light falling on an object has a few typical characteristics. Think of this as sort of the anatomy of shading. In almost all cases, you can see this set of shading. It's especially clear on curved surfaces. The shaded part of the object where the surface points away from the light is the shaded part of the object. It's often called the core shadow. The part pointed toward the light is the light, and its brightest part is the highlight. If there's a surface to catch it, there's often a cast shadow. Around the edge of the shadow, there's a region that is part shadow and part not, and it's called the penumbra. The size of the penumbra is determined by the relative size of the light source to the object casting the shadow, and also the distance of the casting object to the surface that's catching the shadow. And very importantly, there's also this light glowing on the shadow area, and it's called the bounce light. And lastly, if the object is translucent or reflective, you will sometimes see light patterns that are refracted through or reflected off an object onto a surface, and that's called acoustic. Okay, here's a few last things to note. On a curved surface, the transition of the core shadow is usually soft. The bigger the light source, the softer it is. Whereas the transition at the edge of the cast shadow is usually more crisp. Often, the darkest part of the core shadow is pushed by the bounce light to the edge of where it's bright. Artists used to call this pushing an edge, which means to put the darkest shadow and lightest lights near each other to create a strong sense of direct light. You can see that in these examples. The bounce light will be strongest if there's a nearby light surface. Obviously, this is because the light is bouncing off the surface and illuminating the shadow. Also, some surfaces will reflect more bounce light than others, so different scenes will need different amounts of bounce light. The edge of the shadow will be crisp if the light is small or far away, like a bulb, or like from the sun. The edges will be softer if the light is bigger or more diffuse, like light outside on a cloudy day, or like diffuse light coming through a window. If you have direct light coming in a window from the sun, then it's crisp because the sun is essentially a point light source, like a bulb. If you could draw an imaginary line in three-dimensional space from the light source to the edge of the object that's casting a shadow, then onto the surface that's catching the shadow, you can find out where the shadow will fall. The value transition of a shadow is crisper when the point on the object that's casting the shadow is close to the surface it's casting on. As the point on the object is further away, the transition gets softer. This is common for tall objects casting a shadow on the ground, like a tree. Near the base, the shadow is crisper than the shadow of the top. I hope that's clear. Don't worry, with little practice, this stuff is like riding a bike. You won't even think much about it. A couple more things. When there's more than one light, the same rules apply, but for each light. The cast shadows and shading where both lights are dark is the darkest, as one light can lighten the shadows cast by the other light source. Remember, adding lights can only lighten areas, but by relative contrast, any remaining dark areas might appear to get darker. Also, if an object is colored, like the red sphere in this example, its bounce light will have a red glow to it. This is super important to include and get right. In computer graphics, it's called either diffuse reflection, radiosity, or global illumination. Lastly, usually lights have some color to them as well. For most purposes, you can think of light as being one of two kinds, cool or warm. For now, that's enough to grapple with. The most common lighting setup is what's called three-point lighting. I think we've touched on this before. There's the main light, which is the strongest light or key light. And then there's the fill light, which is usually a softer light, and often there's a rim light that catches some edges to help define the shape. Many times you'll see the key light and the fill light being opposite in color temperature, where one will be cool and the other will be warm. So use the PSD files included in this lesson to practice your rendering. The shapes are all set up with layer clipping so you can focus on just the rendering. Again, it's best to use just one soft brush in order to really learn this stuff. And use either pure black or pure white, and just set the opacity very, very low. Try to be as accurate as you can, but don't trace it. Pay attention to where the shadows fall and how dark or light to make the surface values. And focus really hard on the transitions between these values as the lighting moves from light into dark and dark into light. Try to really nail the relative values. Look at each exercise in the PSD file for notes related to that particular exercise. And post your best ones on the forum in the gallery. Okay, practice real hard with this and I'm sure you won't have any trouble with it.